When Roger and I were working on the October sermon schedule, I peeked at the lectionary and I saw that the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector at prayer had been assigned for this Sunday. And I thought, oh yeah, that will be great. It's been a meaningful story to me throughout my life. And I thought, well, this will give me a chance to think aloud about how people have related to and might relate to the concept of sin. I might not have thought this one through all the way as we were preparing because I definitely have a long and complicated history with this topic. And preparing this talk has indeed been even more of a winding road than usual. But here it is, the story as it's found in Luke chapter 18. Jesus also told this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and regarded others with contempt. 2 men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee, standing by himself, was praying thus, God, I thank you that I am not like other people, thieves, rogues, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give 1/10 of all my income. But the tax collector, standing far off, would not even lift up his eyes to heaven, but was beating his breast and saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. I tell you, this man went down to his home justified rather than the other. For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, but all who humble themselves will be exalted. I realize that sermon planning is not a topic of great interest to the general public, but I would like to share this one instance of what I was guessing I would be talking about today. I wrote, I'd like to reflect on some of the harmful ways the concepts of sin, sinfulness, and sinners have been used to control and hurt people, and then explore whether these concepts can have any meaning for us now as people committed to justice and peace. This is still taking shape in my mind, but my thinking is to look at this parable from the perspective of how enmeshed we are all in harmful and destructive systems. Can sin in this context help us understand our own complicity and the injustice around us in ways that help us move forward toward a healthy society? I don't know, but I think it's worth the conversation. And that's where I began. On a personal level, I began by reconnecting with my experiences growing up and how it felt like the concept of sin was weaponized against those who fell on the outside of dominant society and culture because of who they were or what they believed or how they behaved. You might have heard my story, for example, of how our pastor took us kids aside and had us pass around square-cut nails and a crown of thorns made from locust tree branches and had us poke our fingers and hands with the sharp points while he solemnly described to each of us about how we murdered Jesus. Even if everyone else had been perfect, he would tell us, Jesus still would have had to die this horrible death because of your sins. You put Jesus on the cross. It didn't seem to make much of a difference to some of the kids, but to me, I was terrified. I felt horrible just for being alive. And as I grew up, anything I did that was outside of our conservative religious community's expectations could then be used to prove to me how sinful I was and how much I deserved to suffer for that sin. Like many of you, I have a whole collection of experiences and teachings like this. So it's not surprising to me that research has demonstrated that a belief in hell has reliably negative effects on well-being, or that, in the words of this study, people with more malevolent views of God tend to report lower self-esteem, psychological coping, and health resiliency. Jesus' parable also points that the inverse can happen. When you do all the things that you've been promised will reward you with divine approval, it's easy to slip into an inflated view of yourself and contempt for others. This matches my own experiences, both as a child who lived through it and as someone who has spent thousands of hours with others processing their religious trauma. Part of the difficulty of coming to terms with these experiences is that whether people meant to harm us or not, they were willing to use the impacts of that harm to try to influence or control us. This continues to happen in many religious institutions today, where members are still encouraged to stoke feelings of inadequacy and fear because they believe that this is the only way for them to understand how great God is and how their sinfulness is evil and deserves terrible punishment. And I decided not to provide any direct quotes of this at this part because I don't want to give those messages a platform, but I can tell you they were very easy to find. And in all these ways, this wound remains open. This is one of the reasons why I resonated so strongly with this parable as I was growing up. I saw in the tax collector that Jesus thought it was possible for someone to be at the edges of the community and still have goodness in their heart. I didn't relate to that tax collecting business, but there were plenty of other sinners in Jesus' world that I did relate to, and he still sat down and had dinner with them. I didn't have the same words for this as a teenager, but his openness to people who were willing to honestly wrestle with complicated social issues, including their own place in brutal cycles of oppression, was the reason I was drawn to following Jesus. It was an important part of my own healing journey. Having understood this in a religious context, though, it also became easier to see it all around me, observing this dynamic in non-religious contexts. There might not be many people in your social circles today who would brag about religious fasting or tithing 10% of all their income, but we have found plenty of other reasons to hold one another in contempt or to get stuck in self-loathing. It might be hard to remember, but this was an issue even before social media, though social media has certainly greased the wheels of contempt in a way that's made it easier to hate each other than perhaps ever before. To cite just one example, a 2020 study called Media of Contempt found that people who frequently use social media, quote, expressed higher levels of Islamo-prejudice and perceived higher normativity of anti-Muslim hate speech than those who relied on more traditional mass media. To be clear, it's not just social media. This fits the overall trends in our society, such as the continued rise of hate crimes, which latest data shows that hate crimes increased again about 30% in 2021, and the persistence of bullying. It should continue to shock us that about 20%, 1 in 5 of 12 to 18-year-olds report that they've been bullied. On the flip side of this hatred for others, the literature overflows with psychological studies and models for addressing self-hatred, self-loathing, self-disgust, and other ways that we've discovered to have a very antagonistic relationship with our own bodies and our own minds. Both of these habits, contempt for others and contempt for ourselves, self-loathing, turn out to be very unhelpful if we actually want to grow into being more healthy as human beings or as a society. This is a self-perpetuating cycle. Unhealthy societies are more prone to produce contempt, and this kind of contempt makes it difficult to get momentum to make lasting change. And if you've struggled at all with feelings of self-loathing and hatred, you probably know what I'm talking about, especially when your self-criticism is reinforced by the social messages that are there everywhere you turn. Jesus' story is an invitation to break down some of these habits. After all, he told this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and regarded others with contempt. Jesus was intentionally putting his finger on something that can be tender to the touch, asking the question, what gives us permission to regard others or ourselves with contempt? This is a question for practice and reflection. It's wonderful that psychosocial research has been uncovering many aspects of this, but we still have to do the work. We have to work with those insights in such a way that brings about change. It's not enough simply to know. One such reflective tool comes from Thich Nhat Hanh, who taught that there are 3 complexes when it comes to our attachment to self-view. The first 2 are the easiest ones for us to recognize. Superiority assumes and often drives us to prove that we are better than others. Inferiority assumes and often drives us to accept that we are less worthy than others. These are tragic but really familiar concepts. But Thich Nhat Hanh also taught that we can be caught in what he called an equality complex. I am as good as you are, and I'll prove it. And this isn't a criticism of the value of equality, but a reflection on how we get caught up in comparisons. It springs from the delusion that we exist as separate, permanent selves. All three complexes exist in this misunderstanding. The solution to a superiority complex is not to cultivate an inferiority complex. The solution to an inferiority complex is not to cultivate a superiority complex. We're not trying to come to some right mixture of superiority and inferiority and then call it equality. Thich Nhat Hanh was encouraging us to step outside of that paradigm entirely, to go beyond these notions of self and understand how both our attachment to self-views drives so much suffering and how our well-being and suffering is bound up together. I can't hate you without that hate affecting my own well-being. You can't hate me without your hate affecting your own well-being. This insight isn't hypothetical. It was born out of Thich Nhat Hanh's own experience of real-life hatred, injustice, and violence. He had worked tirelessly to advocate for social change to avoid war in Vietnam. And then, after war broke out, he helped found a school in programming and social work to relieve suffering during the conflict. He was eventually forced into exile because both the communists and the nationalists viewed him and his teachings as a threat to their cause. Because he expressed his convictions, recognizing the harm, and neither side liked that, and because he refused to demonize either side, recognizing their humanity, and neither side liked that. After the Vietnam War, from his exile in France, he continued in support, doing his work in support of refugees. He later said about this time that we received hundreds of letters each week from the refugee camps in Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, and the Philippines, hundreds each week. It was very painful to read them, but we had to be in contact. We tried our best to help, but the suffering was enormous, and sometimes we were discouraged. It is said that half the boat people fleeing Vietnam died in the ocean. Only half arrived at the shores of Southeast Asia. Thich Nhat Hanh tells the story of one of those letters which described a young girl who died in this way. In fact, she had jumped overboard into the ocean in order to escape a pirate who had sexually assaulted her. Confronting that suffering, Thich Nhat Hanh meditated for a long time, and his poem, Please Call Me by My True Names, was a result of that meditation. It is an ode to interbeing, both its beauty and its terror, and the insight that our well-being cannot be separated because none of us are ultimately separate. In the poem, he wrote, "Look deeply. Every second I am arriving, to be a bud on a spring branch, to be a tiny bird with still fragile wings, learning to sing in my new nest, to be a caterpillar in the heart of a flower, to be a jewel hiding itself in a stone. I still arrive in order to laugh and to cry, to fear and to hope. The rhythm of my heart is the birth and death of all that is alive. I am the mayfly metamorphosing on the surface of the river, and I am the bird that swoops down to swallow the mayfly." It's into this understanding that he places the terror of the letter he read about the young girl, transforming it into his resolve to practice well, to be part of the transformation of our collective suffering, the healing of our collective trauma, the blooming of our collective awakening. He wrote, "I am the 12-year-old girl, refugee on a small boat, who throws herself into the ocean after being raped by a sea pirate. And I am the pirate, my heart not yet capable of seeing and loving. My joy is like spring, so warm it makes flowers bloom all over the earth. My pain is like a river of tears, so vast it fills the four oceans. Please, call me by my true names, so I can hear all my cries and my laughter at once, so I can see that my joy and pain are one. Please, call me by my true names, so I can wake up, so that the door of my heart can be left open, the door of compassion. You don't have to agree with this, but you can still reflect on it. Observe how the assumptions about how we relate to one another are related to contempt and conflict, how our unskillful ways of carrying those feelings fuel suffering. See if there is space in your heart for both the joy and the pain, for both the friend and the enemy, for both the grief and the compassion. See if the door of your heart can be left open. And this takes us back to Jesus' parable. Jesus wasn't saying that complicity is okay, that harming others is okay, that what the tax collector was doing was okay. His story points toward the value of honestly reflecting on how that harm arises in the context of all our actions and needs. When that harm includes our complicity, then recognizing it is a doorway to change. The Pharisee couldn't step through that doorway. He couldn't be in solidarity with the transformation his society needed because he was so convinced of his own righteousness. He didn't need a change. But the tax collector was closer to that transformation because he understood the pain and the need. The door of his heart stood open. It would be easy to fall into the same trap that Jesus' parable aimed to expose. It's simplistic to look at those you view as enemies and say, oh yeah, Pharisees, I recognize them, and just look at them through that filter. It's easy to think of yourself or your friends and allies through the lens of the tax collector, the good guys. But that's only a trick of time. Jesus chose these personalities for his stories because they turned the easy assumptions of the day upside down. It was easy to think of the tax collector with contempt because his role and his complicity with a violent, occupying empire was contemptuous. The tax collector was exactly the type of person that most listeners would not want to identify with. And that awareness, that criticism of the harm caused by the tax system is important to understand and to act upon. It's good for us to remember that criticism is not the same as contempt. But being open to criticism and changing our minds and our habits when we are wrong are both essential to our personal and our social well-being. At the same time, we cannot use legitimate criticism to disguise or excuse contempt. Again, Jesus' parable makes this point. The Pharisees' contempt was an obstacle to his ability to be part of the change his world needed. The tax collector's humility was the open door to transformation. In terms of reflective or spiritual practice, it's better to avoid siding with one or the other archetypes in Jesus' story. Our lives are complex and complicated, and they reflect a complex and complicated world in which we live. Instead, we can reflect like this. When am I more like the Pharisee? When am I more like the tax collector? Can I observe where contempt has taken root in my own heart? Can I observe how that contempt has become a barrier to well-being and to the possibility of change? Can I loosen those knots and see what new possibilities open up? There are many places we can go with reflections like this. From deconstructing our privilege to healing our internalized oppression, there is a rich place of inner transformation that's available to all of us. Hopefully, we can do that work and work together to link this inner transformation to our outer transformation, bringing real and lasting change into our communities. And if and when we do that, we'll find that it will be a community where no one has to hate themselves and no one has to hate others in order to have a place and fit in. It will be a community with room for us all, where every voice is heard and every need is met. To use Jesus' words, it will be a society where we all care for ourselves and each other with this kind of humility so that everyone can be lifted up. Thank you.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.